seminar. My name is Fola Adeleke. I am the Executive Director of the Global Center on AI Governance. And the Global Center on AI Governance hosts the African Observatory on Responsible AI, which is a knowledge center that was established in 2022 in recognition of the need to promote African voices, experiences, and value systems in the global debate around AI. We bring together scholars from different fields to do work to ensure that the development and adoption of AI technologies supports and are not harmful to
Vamos
African
assistir também.
societies and ways of living. Some of the ways in which we do our work include through policy engagement with different African governments as they introduce new policies and national strategies on AI. We also produce new research that assesses the extent to which Africa is ready for AI adoption. We also serve as conveners of various networks and important stakeholder engagements to promote responsible AI, as well as strengthen the capacity of different stakeholders on the continent by offering various courses and events on AI and human rights in Africa, as well as on AI ethics and policy in Africa. Today's event is the first in a three-part series that is looking at open source AI and the opportunities it presents in Africa. This webinar is focusing on strengthening Africa's ecosystem, recognizing that our AI ecosystem is evolving rapidly, but persistent challenges such as limited infrastructure, fragmented policies, and underfunded research continue to hinder progress. We recognize that open source AI presents a strategic opportunity to bridge these gaps by enabling cost-effective innovation, fostering collaboration, and ensuring African data sovereignty. Today's webinar focuses on a brief written by Sumaya Edan that examines how African nations can build sustainable open source AI capabilities through a dual strategic approach that includes establishing regional resource federations and developing public-private partnerships that are locally relevant. And following Sumaya's presentation, we are going to have a response from um, our panelists who will discuss opportunities for shared computing resources, regional data governance, as well as the potential policy approaches that African governments can take in response to the recommendations in the policy brief. Our guest today to lead our conversation is Sumaya Eden, who is a governance researcher who completed a MPhil in ethics of AI at the University of Cambridge, where she explored equitable AI governance and risk mitigation strategies. And she's currently with the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative. I should add also that Sumaya was one of the researchers that led the important study released by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights about a couple of months ago, looking at the intersection of AI and human rights in Africa. And our respondent is Mr. Julius Peter Thorak, who is the Commissioner for IT at the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in Uganda. He has worked in several positions within the Ugandan government, including in the Secretariat for the National Task Force on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So I'm now going to hand over to Sumaya Eden to lead us in a discussion on this important policy brief. Thank you so much, Sumaya.
Thank you so much, Fola. Just want to confirm if you can actually see my slides.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this session. I will just be explaining what we did for this policy brief, the kinds of findings that we had, and hopefully we'll have a very productive conversation. The focus will actually be looking at Africa's AI ecosystem, and how we can be able to strengthen open source innovation and policy alignment. So why does this actually matter? I guess why are we focusing on open source, and why is this actually relevant right now? I think one of the things that's very clear is we're experiencing an accelerated risk of widening digital divide with regards to who has access to technology and the potential benefits that this technology has. And this means that the more access countries have, the better they are positioned to be able to benefit from this technology. But currently, we are experiencing limitations in terms of access to this technology, which I shall talk about further. The second thing that's actually very critical to understand is Africa has one of the youngest populations, and there's a fast-growing developer community. Every other time I've had a conversation, there's always someone doing a startup or like ideas that are coming up. So in fact, this is something that's very important to keep in mind. At the same time, though, when it comes to technology and the extent to which we can be able to build technologies that can be able to address the needs, then we have a critical limitation, which is access to compute, which is very fundamental and an important resource to be able to use the models or like AI technologies in ways that they're supposed to be used. And lastly, I think this conversation is also very critical, as we can see from a continental level. We've seen the African Commission produce the continental strategy, but also at the same time, we're having adoption rates for technologies increase in other parts of the world. We've also seen the release of DeepSeek in China, and therefore it's become quite an important thing to be able to address when it comes to ways in which we can position Africa in this conversation. In this brief, we look at what exactly is stopping Africa from leveraging open source, if we do in fact say that this technology is a leeway for the continent to be able to benefit. We focus on 4 critical bottlenecks to open source, and we offer two major propositions with the aim of addressing this limitation. There are 4 core bottlenecks that we talk about in the policy brief. The first is data localization. The second is limitations with infrastructure. The third is talent gaps and underfunded research hubs. And lastly, regulatory fragmentation. When we talk about data localization challenges and what it means to leverage open source, for example, Africa in itself has over 3,000 languages, and most of these languages are not in digitized forms, which means to be able to run, let me use the example of an LLM, for example, you need to have data to be able to train these models. If then we need to train, if we need the data to train these models, it means most of our cultures, our views, and our perspectives of the worlds we live in, as well as the needs and the things that we need to address, are mostly written in languages and information. Most of this information is not yet digitized. So which means even if we want to train a model, for example, to address a key specific or like health scenario, we don't actually have existing data to the extent that we need to be able to do something that fundamentally supports a specific sector. The second limitation ties to the first, which is we have scarce African data set and underperforming local AI models. And this ties to, to what extent do we actually have our histories and our cultures and our data and ways we've lived, how are they recorded, and are they existing in the forms that models can be trained on? And the current answer is no. So lastly, we have fragmented data infrastructure and lack of curation expertise. When it comes to models, even in fine-tuning open source models, we need not digitized data on the internet, but there's a specific way in which data should be curated and labeled to be able to feed into these models. Beyond that, we also have fragmented data policies that call for different ways of protecting data, maybe depending on the different Privacy Act. while this is not to dispel the existing of those laws, I think over fragmentation, especially in a continent when we are trying to leverage the amount of data we can be able to have, further makes the situation harder if we have to meet varying levels of requirements. The second thing is infrastructure deficit. I think the key focus here was models and AI technologies require an immense amount of compute and energy to be able to run them. And currently, we only have 5% of AI talent.
Carriers are very exploitative models. So literally, you don't have a recourse against the tech company. And what the government's vision in that.
Thanks. So the next thing is actually in Africa, we only have like about 15% cloud penetration in comparison to, for example, Europe. And we also experience huge processing delays and maintenance costs that undermine innovation. This further limits the extent to which we can be able to leverage models and even fine-tune them for the local. Thirdly, we have talent development gaps. To be able to address or to be able to take advantage of open source models, we need to have we need talent within the continent that are able to understand the needs of the people, where barriers and problems are, so that they can be able to do this. So we have limited experience when it comes to how models are being used, or like in terms of the skills that are needed. We also have funding constraints and in terms of like who is funding startups, the level of access to this money. And lastly, we have limitation when it comes to the tools and the access that we need. And there's a disconnect, especially if we say, for example, a model is open source and has like an open weight, then to how can, for example, researchers or how can we be able to access this? There's very much limitation on this. Lastly is what I've already mentioned, which is regulatory fragmentation. As I said, I think the existence of privacy laws and other regulations are very critical and important and should not be disregarded. However, there are ways in which, when it comes to prerequisites and requirements for data and how data is stored and cross-border data flows, we could improve by making sure that we harmonize how data is shared to be able to limit things like cost, time, as well as the resources that are needed, considering the fact that data ecosystems themselves do take on a lot of energy by themselves. So what exactly is the vision of this, and how do we intend to look at this? I think one of the paths to impact that we are looking at is open source can somehow equate to some form of sovereign development plus community empowerment. It's quite out of reach to be able to develop models from scratch at the moment. And therefore, for the near future, it seems like the African continent will be accessing technology through open source models, at least to be able to leverage it in a way that addresses both near-term concerns and societal concerns, but at the same time in a way that's able to empower communities. So the goal for this is actually to balance out how can we leverage technology while also building community internal and community empowerment and capabilities so the continent can be able to depend on itself. To do this, we should be able to address resource issues such as compute, data sets, regulation, and talent in parallel. What does delay actually mean for this? So the farther we delay from addressing this, there's a risk of over-reliance, which is just one of the things, which means if you can't produce your own data, or if you don't have the necessary talent to be able to build these models and embed them into societies, it means we'll constantly create a loop of reliance to providers or like developed countries. When addressing this problem and when looking at Africa's AI ecosystem, I think in the brief, we talk about how critical it is to understand Africa's AI ecosystem. And this is because we have systemic constraints that have existed beyond AI and the generation of AI that also complicate this problem in itself. So when we look at the ecosystem, we have three critical things that are existing. We have stakeholders, we have resources and processes. All these are interdependent. Stakeholders are like governments, the private sector industries, we have academia and like researchers as well. When we look at resources, we have data, infrastructure as well. And processes are mostly the policies. all these create a form of interdependence, and therefore there are ways in which addressing one or like a failure to address the other leads to the system sort of weakening or like becoming creating a form of stagnation. So if we look at, for example, policy loops, if there is investment uncertainties and resource constraints, then there's like a limited policy implementation. We also see limited infrastructure or like limited data that is produced. At the same time, if there's an investment uncertainties, we also see limited talent pool or like reduced innovation. So the idea of this is to understand that each of the challenges and the barriers that we're addressing do have an interdependence, and therefore addressing one needs a consideration of other contexts as well. With all that in mind, we make two key propositions. The first proposition is to address and leverage open source. We should be able to leverage regional resource federations. When we're looking at this, we make a case for why we think we should have a regional compute in Africa. And first thing is actually, does it actually make sense for each country to have its own data centers? And do we have the resources for this? As it currently stands, we do not, or we don't have the current resources to be able to do this. However, this is in fact a necessity. As we've seen, we need compute to be able to even fine tune or like to be able to leverage open source models. Are there existing examples where we can be able to see? So for example, the Center for High Performance Computing in South Africa exemplifies the potential for regional facilities. You know, it has supercomputers that deliver computing power through nearly almost 33,000 CPU cores and serves multiple African countries, including Botswana, Madagascar, Namibia, Zambia, Ghana, Mozambique, Kenya, and Mauritius. So this model of regional service, for example, is an example of how decentralized facilities can effectively support distributed computational needs. Then how do we build something like this, and where do we locate it? There are three things we look at. The first is strategic location requires, which is basically we need to be able, sorry. We need to be able to locate data centers or this regional facility in areas where we can be able to see there's power infrastructure stability and existing technical expertise. So a good example would probably be near like growing research hubs or like centers or towns that can be able to leverage this. The second thing that we look at is we need to have like tiered pricing for how access is. So for example, like how can different people be able to access this? Can we assign credits, for example, to academic access? Are there different price points for startups? And the last thing is governance. So we need to come up with ways in which we can do fair resource allocation or like cross-border coordination if this is something that we'll be sharing. The second thing we make a case for is having a regional data protection body. I think this is honestly not something new, as there have been ongoing conversations for something like this to happen for a very long time. And the reason for this is we need to be able to solve regulatory fragmentation across AU, the African continent, just in general. There are multiple reasons for this. We need to create a flexible localization and data sharing standards. We don't have the capacity to be able to, we don't have energy and compute in excess. Therefore, we need to be able to save where we can. And therefore, one of the ways is if we have a standard way of labeling data and cross-border data flows, cross-border data sharing, then we'll be able to do this. The main thing that we're trying to leverage for this is we want to encourage that dataset interpretability, considering we have a wide range of languages, cultures, then we want to leverage that even if we want to have access to a specific context, then we can be able to do this from data that's already labeled in other regions. We can also incentivize regional collaboration through this. So like funding projects or like co-investments in certain projects. And the main thing is to reduce compliance costs and unlocks open source model use. The second proposition is public-private partnerships. In the policy brief, actually, one of the key things we see is there's already an appetite to foster open source in Africa. We see the Orange OpenAI Meta partnership, for example, which shows this. They're making AI models freely available for non-commercial use and focusing on African languages. And we think that this will continue to be a way in which these developments will be going. So to that extent, we offer two things under this. One is, in these public-private partnerships, what should be the core priorities that can be able to ensure that we develop and leverage open source in a more sustainable way. The three priority areas we focus on is infrastructure as the first one, which is there needs companies have loads and loads of compute. So if there can be ways in which public-private partnerships can be structured in a way that efficiently allows for access to compute, that will be great. The second priority is African language model development. So partnerships should be able to help and prioritize this. This is because these are hugely underrepresented. But I think beyond underrepresentation of languages is we have cultural preservations. And if moving forward, we will be able to integrate AI as agents into systems, for example, it's critical to have an understanding of context and data that is preserved. And lastly is knowledge transfer, which is how we set up applied research and startup innovation and ways in which we can be able to have a way to upskill and develop the necessary talent that we have in a way that prioritizes long-term sustainability. So how do we actually then operationalize these kinds of public-private partnerships? There are a few reasonable considerations and I would say things to worry about in private partnerships, especially in Africa or developing countries, which is the power dynamic and the leverage points that different countries have. We don't try to answer everything in the question, but in that context, but we try and provide a reasonable considerations that can operationalize these PPPs. The first is governance. We need to have clear contracts that actually provide for ways in which benefits will be distributed or access looks like and what each party is going to gain, especially developing countries. The second thing we look at is resource mobilization. We need clear direction on what cloud credits look like or joint facilities. And the last thing is knowledge transfer. So how do we structure mentorships? Are there joint model trainings? What does open licensing look like? So those are a few things that we talk about. And lastly, I think overall, the theme around this policy brief was open source innovation plus strategic policy alignment can actually create transformative opportunity. Within our reach is ways in which we can harmonize a lot of the policies that are going on. AI is developing a bit too fast, but so is policy or governance. Of course, Africa is not homogeneous, and we all have each country has their own priorities and needs. But I think this is an area where if we can be able to harmonize, we are able to leverage the limited resources that we have in a way that's more sustainable, but also creates an opportunity to invest other resources elsewhere, especially in compute or joint data center. The second thing is converting constraints into opportunities for locally driven AI development. How we try to show this is, for example, the kind of priorities that public-private partnerships should have. And now that initiatives such as the one that I mentioned are already existing, we need to make sure that prioritization should actually be one of the key things that governments should consider so that the important problems are the ones that are addressed. Third is regional resource federation and public-private partnerships leverage collective strength, which is the last thing I talked about. And lastly, ensuring meaningful African participation in the global digital economy. I think open source is one of the ways in which participation for Africa, especially in AI discussions, is looking very fruitful. And I will stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Samia. Your insights are quite consistent with the conversation that took place last month at the inaugural Africa AI Summit in Rwanda. where African ministers were advocating strongly for the idea of shared infrastructure, recognizing the fact that African countries on their own can potentially not independently develop the necessary infrastructure that is needed to turbocharge AI development in the respective countries. And the idea around public-private partnerships is also one that is increasingly being embraced. There was an announcement coming out of that summit as well about the establishment of a chip manufacturing plant in South Africa, for example. And while there appears to be this appetite for regional harmonization when it comes to infrastructure development, at least, it would appear that is not necessarily what is happening at the national level when African states are adopting national AI strategies, which, for all intent and purposes, African states appear to be setting themselves up as, as competing against each other. And Mr. Torak, you've been involved in the development of the national AI strategy in Uganda, and you sit on the Africa Asia AI Policy Network, where a lot of these conversations are happening. If we were to advance with some of these important recommendations, which seems to have been endorsed by African states, these important recommendations coming out of this policy brief, are there policy frameworks that you believe are needed to then potentially bring this all together across African countries, while also preserving this appetite for national sovereignty that we know African states are truly keen on preserving?
Thank you very much. A big thank you also to Sumaya for the very insightful presentation. Yes, we have been working in a number of areas, including with the African Union. We are grateful also for the continental AI strategy, for example, which work we started. I was in the initial phase of it when it was just starting with collaboration with the government of Egypt, among others, to get it started. And the other one is the AI policy blueprint for Smart Africa, which I also participated in the development. And the other one, which is already also in place, we have things like the Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. But the major issue there has been the laxity in signing or ratifying these policy frameworks. So much as they sound so good, implementation is still really very weak. And actually, this policy should be cascading down to the regional and national levels, but there has been a slow process. The other policy frameworks, which Sumaya has touched on, regards infrastructure sharing, again, which you said the ministers have already made commitment on, including public-private partnership. There has also been discussion at the regional level on the issues of internet governance. The other one which needs special attention is AI security and safety. I think we don't have safeguards yet. Also regarding the specific policies on AI safety and security for open AI. So this could be one area which we must focus on, because security must not be an afterthought. The other one, which is still also not yet in place, is regional ethical frameworks. A number of countries have made advancement at national level, but at regional level, it is still weak. We know there is mention in the continental framework of the African Union and then the blueprint under Smart Africa, but implementation is still slow. Not many countries have that framework in place. Then the other one has been on intellectual property. If you are to have open source AI, some people feel that they lose out. So what kind of policy recommendation, what kind of people, are they willing to let go if you are to be able to share? We have some other recommendation later in the in the discussion that we'll make regarding that. Then the other one, of course, is data protection and privacy, where I've already said there has been slow progress in signing the Malabo Convention under African Union. And the challenge of data localization is also still there. Is there enough trust to ensure that the under regional economic communities, we are able to share data freely with some safeguards, of course, in place? Then, then the other issues has to do with AI and data governance frameworks. I think at a continental level, there has been attempts, but still at national levels, not many countries have bodies that are specifically been delegated to handle AI. At times there is fragmentation. You find in some countries it is you have a department under a ministry, then you have an agency trying to handle that. So there is still fragmentation as far as governance, institutional framework is concerned. Then we also have problem of open data. When we talk about data sharing, we don't have viable, up-to-date open data portals. So this really require policy enforcement, because a number of countries have this, but why are they not being fully functional? Then the other issues has to do with collaboration in AI research and innovation. We don't have frameworks that can help us to freely share data and other models in areas of research. So those frameworks must be in place, including issues of interoperability. Then also the issues of regulatory sandboxes. AI-specific regulatory sandboxes are not common. Mostly it is to do with finance, payment systems. Those are the ones where fintechs are the ones who have moved in that space. But AI-specific sandboxes are still not really advancing. So we have to have policies around that to promote sharing of these resources. And then there has also been debate on talent, whether we can develop talent and let them go to other African countries, or they should be free to relocate to the so-called greener pastures. So in this nascent stage, what policy? It is something which is really hard, both at national and regional level. Is it enforceable by policy? It may be, it may not be. No, it may not be. Then one thing that we also lack is AI-enabled devices and infrastructure. Are we going to continue to rely on the things that are brought from other parts of the world? Or do we want policies and frameworks that can help us to develop that capacity for manufacturing AI-ready devices? And then also regarding the issue of open standards for data collection, storage, processing, I know work has been going on in that space. That's why now we are able to share data in the region. For example, in the East African region, some time back, people can be able now to move with their national ID. They don't need passport to move from Uganda to Rwanda and Kenya, among others. So the issue of standards of data sharing is there already, but probably not well implemented. So basically, those are the few thoughts I thought I should bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julius. There's a lot to unpack from what you've said, and I would invite Sumaya to respond to that. So, Sumaya, Julius has clearly articulated some potential frameworks that he sees at the regional level potentially might be needed to operationalize some of these ideas that we've put forward. And I guess a question that I had relates to how feasible these are, especially if we were to layer that on the recommendation in the policy brief for a regional protection body, a regional data protection body. Last week, the Nigerian Data Protection Commission hosted the annual meeting of the network of African data protection authorities. And the data protection authorities there all agreed with the ideas being expressed in this webinar today about the need for the harmonization of data protection laws on the continent, recognizing the fact that a lot of our data protection laws are dissimilar. But they were quick to also point out that harmonization does not equate to singularity. And as a result, they are suggesting that, well, we need to identify which elements of the different data protection laws exist and how we can then, work towards some kind of collaborative engagements. For example, standardized data sharing that Julius has spoken about. But you've worked at the continental level, and you know how potentially difficult the development of some of these frameworks can be. And recognizing also that a debate that's not going away, especially on the African continent, is this idea of, well, even in this race for AI, we must still preserve the data sovereignty through localized, secure approaches, which we discussed in the policy brief, speaking about data localization. So I guess I have a two-part question for you then in response to some of the proposals Julius has put forward. How can open source AI models potentially be designed to respect and protect some of these concerns about African data sovereignty? But also, if we could speak to the feasibility of the implementation of some of these ideas for harmonization and standardization.
Thank you both for the contribution. And I want to echo, first of all, that I do also have similar concerns, especially when it comes to innovation, while ensuring there are the necessary safeguards and security. So I'll just actually start off with, are the propositions that we're making very feasible, and what does this look like? So when it comes to data and data localization, we think in the brief, actually, we talk about flexible localization frameworks, and we talk about 3 ways in which this can be feasible while addressing issues related to harmonization, security safeguards, and basically nations being able to manage their data on their own. The first thing we talk about is distributed data architecture, which is one way in which we can localize this. And a good example is the Smart Africa Alliance, which consists of 39 African countries. And this initiative has been able to show meaningful reduction in data access latency while maintaining sovereignty compliance. So the model basically allows for local storage while facilitating controlled cross-border access to data, and providing a blueprint for the continental scale data management. The second thing we talk about is tiered access protocols. This is actually to address issues related to security and safeguard and protection of this data, basically. One good example that we look at is the Vodafone Africa initiative, and the purpose of this is to strategically balance access with protection through graduated levels of authorization. So the Vodafone Africa initiative, for example, has 6-layer access control framework operating across multiple African countries, including Nigeria, Kenya, Tunisia, and Uganda. The system actually ensures that clinics and hospitals maintain control of their data while enabling 3 key outputs: internal dashboard analysis, the SEDA, which is instance for data availability, and generic data dashboards. The whole purpose, I guess, behind this layering is to be able to have access in a way that also manages security safeguards and authorization. The third thing we talk about is, can we have standardized transfer protocols, and how do we ensure this? So standardized protocols in Africa provide actually distinct regional patterns of success, and we see this in the Great Lakes region cross-border facilitation framework, as well as the East African payment cross-border facilitation framework. For example, in each of these, we see critical infrastructure for secure inter-regional transfers through interoperable policies, or like ways of labeling data. These are more private sector facing and with the permission of governments. But all these three initiatives and directions actually show us that, one, we can have a distributed data architecture where your data is stored in one way, but you're able to manage and access your data at a local level. We can have tiered access to be able to ensure that different levels of access and different types of data sensitivity is respected in a way that ensures regulation. And the third thing, we see a way we can be able to standardize transfer protocols. And one of the things is then, one of the other questions that was raised is why the feasibility of this in terms of different African countries and their priorities. I think from a researcher's perspective is there are a few limitations, and one of the limitation is a fallacy actually, which is that countries having their own ways of developing sovereign technology is the fastest and most efficient way. Actually, that's not true, because we see countries, for example, because of, if you want to have data, cross-border data flow from a different country, if you have to, for example, align your data again with different policies, that's another cost that you have to bear, as well as delays that are happening. A second thing that seems to be a fallacy, for example, is what does it take to actually leverage and address the problems of a specific country within Africa? One thing that we haven't appreciated within AI and technology in itself is we're in different countries, but at the same time, we all seem to be living in one bubble of a world. And therefore, which means the problems that Kenya, Ethiopia is facing could be the same as the ones in South Africa. So issues related to deepfake, if you have strong data protection policies around guarding deepfake, and the neighboring country doesn't have, then it doesn't actually protect you, or in a sense, there is a form of long-term sustainability when it comes to safety of these technologies, if you're able to coordinate beyond one country. And then the third thing I'll talk about is, I think there is misalignment when it comes to priorities for countries. And the idea is to be able to have, for example, the continental strategy to provide a direction. But I think the thing that needs to happen is there needs to be active coordination, and maybe Fola can comment further on this, as he's given some examples on this. Is if your prioritizations are market incentives and to be able to develop startups, the kind of investments or like the kind of priorities or national strategies that you will have will be very different from if, for example, at a regional level, a priority should actually be, can we secure the core resources we all need to have access to and we can't independently have? I think one of the things that we discuss is in compute, we do see Africa's existing foundation of over like 100 data centers, but they're all concentrated in countries like South Africa, Kenya, and a few. And from these data centers themselves, even though they don't have the capacity to offer large scale or like a frontier AI model kind of level access, they serve as a good example and a learning point for ways we can structure centralized and federated systems for having access to this. The economic benefits, for example, of regional computing facilities are immense, and we don't actually, the fallacy is that we can be able to do this on our own. We actually cannot. So to that extent, I would say that there needs to be an alignment and a realization of what our priorities are. Who exactly are the stakeholders who are going to set these priorities? Is it something that needs to be set at a continental level where we agree, okay, these are 3 or 2 common priorities as a continent that we have? Nations or like states on their own can have other priorities and therefore divide their foundations. The second thing is, when it comes to feasibility, are we actually ignoring the existing ways in which systems have worked. We have a few case studies that we've listed before that we can learn from. It doesn't mean that this hasn't been done. It just means it hasn't been done to a scale, to a large scale, and therefore we are not really starting from a ground zero. We have learning points to be able to look at, and these are basically things that as a continent we need to reflect deeper, because the embedding AI systems and taking advantage of them, or like leveraging them, requires an appreciation of our own context. It's not something, for example, like the Brussels effect. You'll go and pick an EU policy and just adapt to it. You actually need to look at what is the existing infrastructure and the needs that we have, and how can we leverage the systems that we have. And until that conversation is had in a way that acknowledges at a continental level what the priorities are, and agreeing, oh, actually, you know, we can't do this on our own, and things like X, Y, and Z should be our priorities, and at a national level, states have their own capabilities, we will stay in a highly state of fragmentation. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is this actually creates an opportunity for private actors to be able to further deepen their own priorities, or to some extent, because of the power dynamics or existing systemic dynamics, it further weakens the bargaining power of a single state. I think there's more power if, like, at a regional level, or more countries within Africa were able to seek certain priorities or agendas for themselves. Yeah, I will leave it there.
Thank you, Sumaya. That is a very, very strong defense of your ideas. And we are already having some questions come in. Julius, so you've got folks acknowledging that, well, you know, Sumaya's, recommendations are certainly worth exploring and should be embraced, but there's a question about what are the ethical implications of some of this regional infrastructure and impact on the environment. If you could speak to this from an Ugandan context, where you've got your national AI strategy development, are you considering your strategy with a view to addressing AI as a tool for equity?
Yes, indeed. Right from our national strategy on the fourth industrial revolution, the issue of, I think you talked also about the issue of environment.
Yes.
Did I get right on that? Yeah, issues of environment is key, because we know that we need green solutions to this infrastructure we will be putting in the region. And it is not sustainable if we are to continue using the current electricity. For example, even if you go to the area of blockchain, part of the reason why we have not been able to set up here in the region, part of it has to do with the extensive amount of energy required. So yes, issues of inclusivity, issues of energy, issues of getting everyone around the country involved, because that is, again, from the ethical AI recommendation of UNESCO, it says no one should be left behind as far as AI is concerned. So yes, government is working around to extend infrastructure around the country, connecting schools, health centers. This is another phase of the project that has been put up. But government also is in the process of setting up an AI enabled data center, but it will not be to the extent that Sumaya is proposing. So probably that would be for local use and supporting the national requirement. But when we now want to go large in testing advanced models, then the regional approach proposed by Sumaya could be considered. The only thing is, how do you set it up? How do you sustain it? What kind of policy frameworks around it? So all these are the questions which we must be asking ourselves. And we have comprehensive policy on waste management. And government right now is setting up regional e-waste centers, taking into consideration that we are having devices that will become obsolete so fast as now that AI is in place. We see so much work going on, and unless a lot is done to make sure that legacy solutions continue to operate, which may not be the case. Thank you.
Thank you. Sumaya, there's a question about African universities and small startups effectively contributing to open source AI projects. And in responding to that question, I'll also invite you to also speak about, the, conversations that's also taking place about the fact that some of these so-called open source AI models are not truly open source. And so how do you navigate that? But before you respond to that, there's a question coming from Wafa about what is uniquely African about some of the challenges that Sumaya has set out, especially in relation to language. And because we're almost at time, my response to you, Wafa, would be we've just released a comprehensive Africa AI landscape study that is available on our website. And I invite my colleagues to also drop a link to this study there, where we set out quite a number of use cases. Right? Several use cases are discussed in detail in this study that discusses these unique African challenges and the specific, solutions that have been adopted across the continent in relation to some of these challenges, especially in relation to language. Sumaya.
In response to the question of research and students, I think there are two main things that I can talk about is how can academic institutions and research centers leverage and have access to compute, which is very critical for these models. And it's currently the biggest bottleneck across African countries. And I think one of the few things that come to my mind is, can governments allocate, like major research centers in different countries, especially academic institutions? How can we be able to empower them and research centers? And then the second thing is, what does knowledge transfer and what are the ways in which we can design them? I think if we can be able to set partnerships, I think most of these private companies that are developing them have educational programs where, for example, like PhDs and can carry out like exchange programs. If we're able to create further accessibility and to use basically these initiatives, that will also make a key difference. And then to answer the question of what exactly is open source and are they actually open source, I'll talk about open source models that have their weights open, so open weights, so they're fully open source. So you can see how the model was trained, everything that the model has had access to. And an example of this is Llama. And then there are open source models that have closed weights. So they are open source, but you can't actually see the ways in which they were trained, and you can't have the full access to the model in themselves. One really good paper that addresses this is access to the models themselves doesn't equate to use of the technology, because it doesn't, by just having access to ChatGPT, there's no utility out of it. And therefore there are other steps that are taken and or rather like need to be taken in place. And depending on whether a model is fully closed off or you have access to a certain point, then it means the way in which you can fine tune it or the changes that you can be able to make are very limited. Nonetheless, I think there's still an opportunity in the sense that whether closed models or like closed weight or open weight models, there's still an opportunity to be able to retrain models that can be able to address the needs of these different countries.
Thank you, Sumaya. We're unfortunately at time, but just to quickly respond to the two questions that are standing about, well, the policy gaps currently preventing the broader adoption of ethical AI across African countries. I would strongly encourage you to join our second webinar, which is happening in 2 weeks, we should be looking at the leveraging of AI for sustainable development in Africa. And this also will be addressing the question about the concern around grid destabilization. This webinar is going to be hosted by us, but will be presented by Dr. Kolofelo Kugler, who's also written an excellent policy brief about this and will be tackling some of these questions that have been raised. I would like to use this opportunity to thank Sumaya, Julius, and all of you for joining us today. Thank you for your engagement, and hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Have a good day, everyone.